July 25, 1944. Normandy, France. The morning sky was bruised with smoke and thunder. Rain clung to the hedgerows, turning the narrow lanes into rivers of mud. Along the battered front near St. Lo, the earth itself seemed to tremble. For weeks the Americans had been trapped in the Bocage, those suffocating, maze-like fields that chewed up men and machines alike. German generals scoffed from their bunkers. To them, the U.S. Army was clumsy, inexperienced, and incapable of maneuvering through Europe's ancient terrain. They called it an army of amateurs. But that morning, the ground would tell a different story. It began with the roar of 1,000 engines and the name of the man who would lead them, George S. Patton. Patton's arrival in France was like a storm breaking. He had been held in reserve, waiting, pacing, and snarling at delay. When the order finally came to unleash the Third Army, his words were curt, almost prophetic. "We're going to keep going until we run out of gas, and then we'll keep going on foot." Every soldier knew the name. To his men, he was a figure out of legend, a cavalryman reborn in steel. To the Germans, he was the ghost of an older war, a man they had studied but dismissed. They remembered his slapping of soldiers, his outbursts, and his temper. They didn't yet understand that the same fury would soon move armies like fire across a continent. The breakout from Normandy began with an explosion that could be heard for miles. 2,000 Allied bombers tore the front open in one of the most devastating aerial assaults of the war. Columns of smoke rose a mile high. German defenses, already stretched thin, were shredded in minutes. Tanks burned. Communication lines vanished. A division commander radioed a final, broken message before static swallowed his voice. Into that chaos rolled Patton's armor. M4 Shermans grinding forward, treads clattering on shattered stone, engines coughing dust. Behind them, infantry poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. For weeks, Allied planners had feared a stalemate. The Germans, commanded by the cautious von Kluge and the cunning Rommel, believed the Americans lacked the finesse to exploit a breakthrough. But Patton had spent months drilling speed into his corps commanders. His creed was motion. He called it violence of execution. When Operation Cobra tore the German line apart, Patton didn't hesitate. Within 24 hours, his lead elements had advanced 20 miles beyond expectations. Villages liberated by dawn were already miles behind by dusk. Locals stood by the roadside, stunned at the pace. To them, it looked like a river of armor. German headquarters refused to believe the reports. One colonel in the 7th Army dismissed the first messages as exaggerations by frightened field officers. Another insisted the Americans were overextending themselves, that their supply lines would collapse. But each dawn brought new disaster. Convoys ambushed, bridges seized intact, artillery wiped out before it could reposition. The Wehrmacht had faced Soviet waves, British professionalism, and years of attrition. They had never faced speed like this. The secret was not just Patton's charisma. It was organization, the invisible web of logistics and communication that followed every advance. Truck convoys from Cherbourg thundered day and night, carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. Engineers worked ahead of the columns, clearing wreckage, laying pontoon bridges, and redirecting traffic through shattered towns. Where German armies relied on rigid orders transmitted hours late, Patton's corps moved with living precision. Radio chatter filled the air, and maps were updated hourly. It was war conducted like a symphony, fast, fluid, and merciless. By July 30th, the Third Army was officially activated. Its insignia, a bold blue A, was painted on thousands of vehicles now fanning south. The men called themselves Patton's footsteps. Wherever that symbol appeared, resistance crumbled. At Avranches, the Germans made one last desperate stand, deploying tanks and anti-tank guns along narrow roads. But Patton's forces struck from 3 directions at once, slipping through side roads, enveloping entire units before they realized they were surrounded. By August 1st, the gateway to Brittany was open. The German high command was silent. Inside their bunkers, generals pored over maps that no longer matched reality. Divisions vanished overnight. Entire corps were reduced to remnants by air power and encirclement. They blamed each other, communications, supply failures, Allied air superiority. Few admitted the truth. They had underestimated the Americans. They had seen them as factory soldiers, untested by the ruthless discipline of European war. But Patton's men were not inexperienced. They were relentless. They moved like hunters, always forward, never waiting for orders longer than an hour. In the span of a week, they advanced farther than some armies had in months. The landscape of France became their proving ground. Columns stretched beyond the horizon. Shermans, half-tracks, fuel trucks, and jeeps. Dust clouds rose above every highway. French civilians threw flowers at the convoys and waved flags from ruined balconies. Children rode bicycles alongside tanks, trying to keep up until the roar of engines drowned their laughter. For many, it was the first sign that the occupation was ending. For Patton's men, it was proof that momentum could be a weapon. Behind the spectacle, coordination was everything. Field radios crackled with constant updates. Each division commander carried detailed situation maps, adjusted hourly. When fuel ran low, convoys diverted from other sectors within minutes. When bridges collapsed, engineers erected new ones overnight. The Third Army operated as if guided by a single hand. Patton often slept in his command car, studying maps by flashlight. He spoke little. When he did, his words carried the sharp edge of destiny. "We're not going to let up until we're in Germany." By mid-August, German morale was collapsing. Captured officers spoke of confusion, disbelief, and panic. They had expected a slow crawl through France, not a mechanized hurricane. Some believed Patton was using twice as many divisions as intelligence reported. Others claimed the Allies had invented new kinds of fuel or radio control. They could not comprehend how their disciplined army was being outmaneuvered day after day. Every assumption, the superiority of their doctrine, their defensive tactics, their mastery of war, was evaporating under the heat of American momentum. In one command post near Le Mans, a captured field note simply read, "They come faster than we can retreat." Those words spread through Allied lines as a trophy. The Americans who had once been mocked now moved like ghosts through enemy defenses. Every sunrise revealed another 50 miles of liberated ground, another shattered regiment left behind. The German generals, who had dismissed the Americans as students of war, were now studying their own defeat. But Patton was not satisfied. Each mile gained demanded another. Each victory only sharpened his hunger. He drove his staff mercilessly, insisting that opportunity was fleeting and that the Germans would recover if given even a day's rest. Fuel shortages, exhaustion, broken vehicles, none of it slowed his intent. To those who warned of overextension, he replied with a single phrase, "Attack. And keep attacking." The map of France was turning Allied blue at a pace no strategist had predicted by the second week of August. Even Eisenhower and Bradley were astonished. The Third Army had advanced more than 400 miles in less than 3 weeks. German field reports were a blur of retreating arrows and lost units. Patton's gamble, speed over caution, had worked beyond expectation. But the faster he moved, the more fragile his supply line became. Trucks were running dry, engines overheating, and men surviving on captured rations. Every success carried the shadow of disaster. And yet, Patton pressed on. The chase was not over. Beyond the Seine River, beyond the dust and the wreckage, lay the next great decision, a move that could trap an entire German army or risk everything he had built. The thunder of engines rose again, echoing through the valleys of France. As if the war itself was holding its breath, Patton was about to gamble the future of the campaign on one audacious maneuver. The world would soon learn whether speed could truly conquer strategy. The secret behind Patton's lightning advance was not simply his will. It was the machine that followed him, the invisible backbone of steel, fuel, and communication that turned chaos into precision. The Germans believed they understood the tempo of war. They measured it in divisions per week and in bridges per day. But the Americans were fighting with a new rhythm, one forged in factories and powered by radio waves. It was not brute force that carried Patton across France. It was synchronization. Every tank that rolled forward owed its life to a river of fuel trucks stretching hundreds of miles back to the Normandy beaches. The Red Ball Express, as soldiers called it, began operation in August 1944, and it became one of the most astonishing logistical feats of the war. Over 6,000 trucks, driven day and night, carried ammunition, rations, and gasoline to the front. Black and white soldiers alike manned the convoys, their headlights blacked out, following cat-eye markers down narrow roads at full throttle. Maintenance crews worked without rest, patching tires and replacing engines under dim lanterns. If a truck stopped, it was pushed aside. Nothing stopped the flow. For every mile Patton's tanks advanced, the Red Ball made sure they never ran D or Y to AT. The heart of this momentum was communication. Patton had insisted that every corps, division, and even platoon be wired into a network of field radios. The SCR-300 walkie-talkie and the powerful SCR-508 tank radios allowed his commanders to adapt in minutes, not hours. Orders that once took a day to transmit were now instantaneous. A tank platoon caught in ambush could call for artillery support before the enemy even adjusted their sights. It was the birth of networked warfare, a silent advantage the Germans neither detected nor understood. While their own communications were trapped in rigid hierarchies, Patton's army moved like a single organism, reacting, countering, and striking. Then there was the weapon itself, the M4 Sherman. By 1944, it was no longer the most armored tank on the field, nor the most powerful, but it was reliable. Its Continental or 975 engine could be repaired in hours. Its tracks could be replaced in the mud. American engineers had designed it not as a duelist, but as a racer, a tank that could move faster than the enemy could react. The Germans mocked its thin armor, but they could not match its numbers. For every Panther that rolled out of a German factory, 5 Shermans crossed the channel. Behind each one stood a team of mechanics, welders, and factory workers from Detroit and Pittsburgh who never saw the front but fought through their labor. Patton often said, "Wars are won by logistics." In France, his army proved it. The first test of this machine came in early August near the town of Argentan. Intelligence suggested a pocket of retreating German units trying to escape north. Patton saw the opportunity at once. He ordered the 15 Corps under General Wade Hayslip to strike east, while the 19 Corps under Corlett drove from the north. The goal was audacious: to close the Falaise Gap and trap the remnants of Hitler's 7th Army. The terrain was treacherous, rolling hills, hedgerows, and narrow farm roads. German armor lurked behind every curve. But Patton's forces were already moving before the enemy finished retreating. In less than 24 hours, hundreds of tanks and half-tracks poured into the sector. Supported by mobile artillery and close air support from P-47 Thunderbolts circling overhead, what followed was a battle of speed and nerves. German commanders ordered counterattacks, hurling Tiger tanks against the American flanks. But every strike met a coordinated response. Artillery batteries, linked by radio, adjusted fire within seconds. Forward observers guided bombers with precision unseen in earlier campaigns. The sky rained fire on German columns trapped on the narrow roads. Smoke choked the valley. Soldiers later described the smell of burning oil and scorched wheat hanging for days. The enemy had been masters off blitzkrieg. Now they were caught in a mirror of their own doctrine. For the German soldiers trapped within the pocket, it was a nightmare. Convoys jammed, horses panicked, and officers shouted orders no one could hear. Patton's armor closed the noose tighter by the hour. From the south, American units captured town after town: Le Mans, Alassa, Argentan, each name marking another point of collapse. Villagers watched in disbelief as German prisoners marched by the thousands, hands raised, faces hollow. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had stormed across Europe in 1940, now fled before an army they had called inexperienced. The arrogance of years was evaporating under Patton's advance, but victory came with a brutal cost. The roads were littered with wreckage, burned tanks, shattered trucks, and the bodies of men and animals tangled together. The scale of destruction defied comprehension. Pilots flying above described the valley as a single, continuous grave. Yet amid the devastation, American units moved with machine-like discipline. Engineers cleared debris within hours, traffic control units redirected convoys through alternate routes, and medics set up triage tents in churchyards. War had become an industrial operation, each piece functioning to sustain momentum. Even the enemy began to notice. Captured diaries spoke of a machine that does not stop. Patton's tactical doctrine was simple: attack relentlessly, never pause long enough for the enemy to reorganize. His divisional commanders embodied this principle. Major General Manton Eddy of 12 Corps advanced 75 miles in 5 days. Walton Walker's XX Corps captured bridges that were supposed to be destroyed. The Germans tried to regroup along the Seine River, believing the Americans would need weeks to refuel. Instead, they found Patton's tanks already crossing. The Third Army was now operating at speeds no staff officer had predicted. Supply depots struggled to keep up. Drivers slept in their trucks. Soldiers ate cold rations, yet morale never wavered. They were chasing history itself. Even the weather seemed to conspire in their favor. Clear skies returned, allowing Allied air power to dominate. Every daylight hour brought another strike on retreating columns, another bridge shattered behind enemy lines. The Luftwaffe, once a terror in the skies, was nearly invisible. American soldiers began to joke that if they saw a German plane, they should make a wish. But behind the humor lay awe. They had become the stormed WWII late August. The encirclement of the Falaise Pocket was nearly complete. Over 50,000 German troops were trapped, their armor reduced to smoldering husks. The once proud divisions that had held Normandy disintegrated in days. Patton's forces had not only broken through, they had shattered the myth of German invincibility. Reports from captured officers spoke of disbelief. They could not understand how such coordination, such speed, was possible. Their own generals blamed weather, fuel, fate, anything but the truth. The truth was that the Americans had mastered the mechanics of modern war. When Patton arrived at the front to inspect the aftermath, he stood silently for several minutes. The field stretched for miles, black with smoke and wreckage. He turned to his staff and muttered, "This is what happens when you don't move fast enough." It was not triumph, but grim satisfaction. For him, speed was mercy. The faster the war ended, the fewer men would die. His officers understood. They saluted and moved on. The Third Army rolled eastward again, engines growling, tracks grinding over the ruins of a once mighty army. The lesson of that summer was written not in glory, but in dust and fuel and blood. The Germans had measured war by courage. The Americans, under Patton, measured it by momentum. And that difference was about to rewrite the map of Europe. By September 1944, the fields of France were littered with the wreckage of retreat. Burned-out tanks, twisted artillery, and abandoned helmets marked the trail of the German collapse. The speed of Patton's advance had stunned not only the enemy but also his own allies. The British called it reckless. The Germans called it impossible. The Americans called it Patton. In little more than a month, his army had crossed hundreds of miles, liberated dozens of cities, and forced the German high command into chaos. Yet behind every victory lay a question that echoed through both camps. How had this been possible? The truth went deeper than tactics or luck. It was psychological. Patton's presence on the battlefield altered the rhythm of war. His voice, his temper, and his relentless drive infected his men with urgency. He demanded movement at all costs, not because he loved risk, but because he understood fear. In battle, hesitation kills. He believed the enemy must never feel safe for a single night. Even his harsh discipline, the curses, the punishments, the impossible orders, were tools to forge a singular mindset: never stop. His soldiers learned to live in motion, to trust that chaos was their ally. And through that chaos, they broke the enemy's will. In the German ranks, despair spread faster than orders. Commanders who had once mocked the Americans now spoke in whispers about their speed and coordination. Intercepted messages revealed panic. One division commander pleaded for fuel. Another begged for permission to retreat. None came. The Wehrmacht, trained in rigid obedience, could not adapt to an enemy that refused to slow down. German soldiers watched in disbelief as American columns appeared miles behind what had been declared secure. Bridges that were blown at dawn were already replaced by dusk. The Third Army's engineers, mechanics, and drivers became weapons as vital as any gun. Across occupied France, civilians saw liberation arrive like a storm. Villages that had suffered 4 years of silence erupted overnight with cheers and flags. Children climbed atop tanks, and women threw flowers into passing trucks. For many, the American flag symbolized more than victory. It was the return of time itself, of normal life stolen by occupation. Patton's men, covered in dust and sweat, barely slowed. They waved back, grinning from open turrets, and disappeared toward the next horizon. Liberation, for them, was not a pause. It was the fuel that kept them moving. Strategically, the impact was seismic. The Third Army's advance didn't just free territory. It fractured the entire German defensive structure in the West. Hitler's armies were now split, their communication collapsing. Command posts received outdated reports. Divisions fought in isolation, and counterattacks dissolved before they began. In Berlin, generals argued over who to blame. Some accused the Luftwaffe of failure. Others cursed Allied air power or American factories. But none dared admit the unthinkable. The Americans had mastered mobility, and the Germans could no longer match it. Behind the lines, the strain was enormous. The Red Ball Express ran itself to exhaustion. Drivers slept in their seats. Mechanics patched fuel tanks with tin and wire, and bridges buckled under endless convoys. Yet the system held. It was a triumph of organization, an orchestra of logistics conducted across a continent. American engineers built new depots overnight, local French railroads were repaired within days, and airfields sprouted wherever Patton's fighters needed them. The army was no longer dependent on a fixed front. It was a moving city, self-sustaining, unstoppable. Patton knew the risks. Fuel shortages threatened to halt the momentum. Eisenhower urged caution. Montgomery demanded supplies for his own northern offensive. Patton, impatient as ever, wrote in his journal that history favored the bold. He argued that the enemy was collapsing and that a few more weeks of pressure could end the war. But the higher command believed otherwise. Orders came down to slow the advance, conserve fuel, and prepare for a winter defense. It was a bitter moment for the man who lived to attack. His army, the fastest in modern history, was forced to stop. The pause allowed the enemy to breathe. In the forests of the Ardennes, German divisions regrouped in secret, planning one final counterattack. Patton sensed it before anyone else. His staff thought he was restless. In truth, he was reading the enemy's mind. When the Battle of the Bulge erupted in December, the Third Army was already pivoting north, engines roaring through snow and ice. It was another moment of impossible speed. Within days, his troops were striking into the flanks of the German offensive, relieving the besieged town of Bastogne and reversing the course of the battle. What had begun as Hitler's gamble ended as proof that Patton's mobility doctrine could turn defense into offense overnight. Psychologically, the transformation of the American soldier was complete. The men who had landed at Normandy uncertain and cautious were now professionals of movement. They trusted their machines, their radios, their supply lines, and above all, their momentum. The myth of German invincibility had crumbled. Where once soldiers spoke of the enemy with fear, now they spoke of him with grim respect and confidence. The lessons burned into their memory would define not just the end of this war, but every war to come. By spring 1945, the Third Army had crossed the Rhine, shattered the remnants of the Wehrmacht, and driven deep into Germany. Along the way, they liberated thousands of prisoners, uncovered concentration camps, and saw the true horror they had been fighting to end. Patton's men, who had laughed and shouted across France, now fell silent before the sights of Buchenwald and Ohrdruf. The speed that had once thrilled them felt suddenly hollow. They understood now that their relentless drive had carried them to the heart of humanity's darkest chapter. And yet, they kept moving. Because stopping meant remembering, and remembering too long meant breaking. When the war in Europe ended, Patton stood at the peak of victory and the edge of irrelevance. His army was unmatched, his tactics studied by friend and foe alike. The German generals who survived interrogation admitted their astonishment. They spoke of an army that moved like lightning, supplied itself like a machine, and fought with a discipline that defied its reputation. They no longer dismissed the Americans. They envied them. The same men who had once mocked Patton's eccentricity now studied his methods in quiet admiration. The legacy of that summer lived on long after the guns fell silent. The Red Ball Express became the blueprint for modern military logistics. Patton's demand for constant communication inspired the doctrines of the Cold War. His emphasis on speed, coordination, and initiative shaped the armored divisions that would later roll across Kuwait and Iraq half a century later. Even the U.S. Army's motto of mobility traced its lineage to those weeks in France when one man's obsession with momentum redefined warfare. And yet, for Patton, glory was never enough. He once said, "All glory is fleeting." Perhaps he knew that speed, like victory, cannot be captured, only remembered. His soldiers returned home to quiet towns and empty fields, carrying the memory of dust, diesel, and thunder. The world moved on, rebuilt, and forgot the sound of endless engines pushing across a broken continent. But in the chronicles of war, the story remained. An army once dismissed as inexperienced had outthought, outbuilt, and outrun one of the most formidable militaries in history. The German generals who watched their maps unravel in 1944 never understood that they had been fighting not just men, but an idea of movement, freedom, and relentless will. Patton embodied it. His soldiers lived it. And together, they proved a truth as old as war itself. When discipline meets daring, when courage is matched by speed, even the proudest empires crumbled. In the end, France was not just liberated by power. It was liberated by momentum.